Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into a complex chapter in Australian financial oversight. We're zeroing in on Mr. Greg Medcraft's time as chair of ASIC, the Australian Security and Investment Commission. That was from, 2011 to 2017? And the sources, well, they paint a picture of some serious conflicts, international duties versus local crises, big talk versus maybe less action. So the big question we're asking, for you listening, is this. How did his leadership, his background, maybe even his priorities, shape the handling of the Trio Capital disaster, Australia's biggest superannuation theft?
Yeah, and you have to start with that core paradox, really.
Huh.
Medcraft was famously tagged the poacher turned gamekeeper.
Right.
I mean, this is someone who spent decades deep inside the world of structured finance, securitization, the very financial engineering that some sources directly link to the global financial crisis.
And then he becomes the top corporate cop.
Exactly. So that background, that perspective he brought, it's impossible to ignore. It kind of hangs over everything that happened during his time at ASIC.
Okay, so let's unpack how he even got the job, because the way he was appointed, well, it wasn't exactly standard procedure, was it?
No, not at all. He took the chair in May 2011. But the role, unusually, wasn't advertised publicly.
So no open competition.
Correct. Prime Minister Julia Gillard's government granted an exemption to its own rules about open, merit-based appointments for these kinds of top public service jobs. So yeah, becoming head of the regulator without that usual open process, it definitely raised some eyebrows right from the get-go.
And his background, as you mentioned, wasn't just in finance. It was in the really high-stakes, complex end of it. 30 years at Société Générale, Sogin.
Huge global investment bank. And his roles there were central to this whole story. We're talking leadership in structured finance, securitization.
Which, just to remind everyone, involves bundling up assets, often risky ones like mortgages, and selling them as securities. The kind of stuff central to the GFC.
Precisely. He even co-founded the American Securitization Forum. He was a major player in that world.
And his time at Sogin, it wasn't exactly quiet, was it? There were some major issues happening concurrently.
That's a key piece of context. While he was there, Sogin faced enormous turbulence. He was overseeing U.S. mortgage-backed securities businesses, for instance, from 2005 to 2008.
Right, in the lead-up to the crash.
Exactly. During a period when the bank faced allegations of breaching corporate laws related to those very securities. And you also had massive scandals, like the Jerome Kerfield trading loss, nearly $5 billion vanished.
Wow.
And the Samarth Agrawal case, stealing trading code. So the point is, he came from an environment where, let's say, systemic risk and misconduct were very real possibilities.
So you have this figure, deeply knowledgeable about financial system weaknesses, appointed under unusual circumstances, and then boom, Trio Capital explodes onto the scene. A massive domestic fraud.
Right, but here's the tension. The sources strongly suggest his focus wasn't entirely, or maybe even primarily, on that domestic crisis.
He had his eye on the international stage?
Very much so. At the same time all this was happening, Medcraft was also the head of IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions.
Okay.
Now, the Parliamentary Joint Committee, the PJC, looking into Trio back in 2013, they actually expressed some hope. They thought, okay, maybe his IOSCO role could help close loopholes that allow international fraud like Trio.
Sounds reasonable on the surface.
It does. But the practical reality, according to the criticism in the sources, was an awful lot of time spent focusing outside Australia.
You mean actual physical absence?
Yeah.
Lots of travel.
Significant amounts. The sources point to him being out of the office for, I think, roughly 3 months in one particular year, and specifically in 2013, over 50 days overseas, all while drawing his full salary as Australia's chief regulator.
And the cost. Do we know what that international focus costs taxpayers?
We do. If you tally up the overseas trips documented between 2013 and 2016, the figure cited is around $649,000, give or take.
Wow. So nearly $650,000. Where was he going?
All over. St. Petersburg, Davos for the World Economic Forum, Lima, Madrid, Seoul. I mean, it's a long list of global financial centers and conference locations.
And this is happening right when Trio victims are desperate for answers and action back home?
That's the core criticism. The timing was, let's say, unfortunate. It culminated very publicly in that Senate estimates hearing in June 2013.
Ah, yes. What happened there?
Well, ASIC was being grilled about its handling of domestic issues, including Trio, but Medcraft wasn't there to answer the tough questions. He was in St. Petersburg for an IOSCO meeting.
So his deputy had to face the music.
Exactly, which led to that now famous comment from Senator John Williams. He basically said Medcraft shouldn't worry about the world's problems until he fixes Australia's first.
Ouch, a pretty direct hit.
It summed up the frustration perfectly. The perception was that Australia's own regulatory failings were taking a backseat to global networking.
Okay, so there's the cost and the optics of the international travel, but the sources suggest there's another layer here, a specific international connection to Trio that ASIC under Medcraft didn't seem keen to publicize.
This is where it gets really intriguing and, frankly, quite pointed in the source material. Despite all this international activity, all the talk about global cooperation via IOSCO,
Yes.
ASIC remains silent, publicly at least, about a specific U.S. link in the Trio capital scheme. The sources highlight a connection involving Hunter Biden, son of the then U.S. Vice President.
Hunter Biden. How was he connected?
The claim is that Australian superannuation money, lost in the Trio fraud, potentially ended up in a fund owned and operated by him in New York. Yet ASIC apparently made no public mention of this.
So while championing international transparency, ASIC wasn't highlighting a potentially crucial international link in its biggest case.
That's the contradiction the sources point to. It raises questions, doesn't it? Was this silence influenced by his international role? Or perhaps relationships formed through that role? Or maybe his own background? It's a significant unanswered question based on the material we reviewed.
Right. So let's shift from the travel and the appointments to what Medcraft himself was saying versus what ASIC was doing, particularly on Trio, because he made some very strong statements about financial crime.
He certainly did. Medcraft was known for his very potent sound bites. He publicly stated that the Trio fraud showed the whole financial system was wanting.
Okay.
Strong words. He demanded accountability, saying gatekeepers must be made accountable. He talked about appalling audit quality and warned it could lead to Enron-style collapses right here in Australia.
And didn't he make that famous comment about Australia being a haven for criminals?
Yes, the one that got a lot of headlines. Australia is paradise for white-collar crime.
So he's diagnosing the illness perfectly, it seems. Systemic issues, gatekeeper failures, poor audits.
Exactly. He identified the symptoms, the systemic weaknesses. But here's the kicker, according to the sources. Despite recognizing all the conditions for an Enron-style collapse, and despite Trio fitting that description,
He never actually labeled Trio as Australia's Enron.
he never publicly made that direct connection, no. He diagnosed the potential for an Enron here, but seemed reluctant to apply that label to the massive ongoing case on his own doorstep.
And what was the practical consequence of not calling it that for the victims?
Well, look at the comparison. In the actual U.S. Enron case, creditors eventually recovered about 53 cents on the dollar.
Okay, not whole, but something significant.
Right, the Trio victims. The sources state they received absolutely nothing, 0 cents in compensation payout for the fraud itself.
Wow, 0. So why the disconnect between identifying the problem and seemingly the lack of recovery focus? What was his philosophy on enforcement?
It seems rooted in a particular view of ASIC's role. He supported litigation funders, for example. But he also stated that ASIC's job was primarily about enforcing the law, not necessarily recovering funds for victims. Because, in his words, it is a free market. There was also a deeper skepticism about regulation itself. He was quoted saying things like, disclosure doesn't work in many cases, and we can't have cops on every street corner.
So less intervention, more faith in the market sorting itself out, even after a massive fraud.
That appears to be the underlying principle suggested by those statements. A focus on market mechanisms over, perhaps, direct consumer restitution in fraud cases.
Which brings us directly to the impact on the Trio victims themselves. The sources allege ASIC didn't just fail to help, but actually took actions that harmed or misled them.
Yes, the criticisms look out are quite severe. They include accusations that ASIC withheld important evidence from courts, from the parliamentary inquiry.
Withheld evidence.
That's the claim. Also, that ASIC spread misinformation and gave misleading advice. For instance, telling victims their best bet was to sue their financial advisors.
Why was that misleading?
Because the scale of the underlying fraud was so total, it likely nullified the professional indemnity insurance those advisors held. So suing them was, arguably, sending victims down a dead end, wasting more time and money.
Yeah. Anything else?
A particularly troubling point raised is that Medcraft and ASIC apparently failed to inform victims about their legal right to submit victim impact statements during the criminal trial phase.
Which would have allowed them to tell the court how the crime affected them before sentencing.
Precisely, denying them that voice in the justice process.
This feels like more than just oversight. The sources seem to suggest a deliberate strategy, perhaps even politically motivated.
That's certainly the allegation. The claim is that the narrative around Trio was intentionally shifted, politicized even, by Medcraft and the relevant minister at the time, Bill Shorten,
Shifted away from fraud
towards being primarily an issue of poor financial advice. By framing it that way, the argument goes, you downplay the massive systemic international fraud.
And why would they allegedly do that? What was the suggested motive?
Well, the sources propose a couple of things. For Medcraft, maybe it helped protect his position. Focusing on advice failures is less damaging to regulators' reputation than admitting a huge fraud happened on your watch.
Okay. And for Mr. Shorten?
The suggestion is it served a political agenda related to superannuation. By highlighting the risks supposedly associated with the kind of funds involved in Trio, specifically self-managed super funds or SMSFs, it can be used to argue against SMSFs, which were and are major competitors to the large industry super funds, many of which have links to unions. So discredit the competition, potentially steer money towards union-linked funds. That's the alleged political calculus outlined in the sources.
So the claim is the victim's plight was sort of caught in the middle of a push to reshape the superannuation landscape, while ASIC looked the other way on the core fraud.
That's the essence of the criticism leveled in the material. A failure by Medcraft and ASIC to stand up for the victims, to call the crime what it was, potentially because other agendas were at play. The ultimate assessment from these sources was harsh. Medcraft was unable to change the culture of Australian banking.
And that criticism wasn't isolated, was it? Concerns about ASIC's effectiveness, especially regarding consumers, seem to have grown.
They did. The perceived failures led to broader questions about whether ASIC was truly effective, particularly in protecting consumers. This idea of industry capture started getting discussed more.
Meaning the regulator gets too close to the industry it's supposed to police.
Exactly. Serving the industry's interests, perhaps unconsciously, rather than the public's. It got so bad that one consumer advocate quoted in the material suggested maybe consumer protection should just be taken away from ASIC entirely, calling their performance abysmal.
A pretty damning verdict.
Extremely.
So wrapping this up, we have Greg Medcraft, a figure from the world of high finance, appointed controversially, travels the world talking transparency for IOSCO. Yet back home, ASIC under his leadership is accused of downplaying Australia's biggest super fraud, failing to pursue key international links transparently, offering poor advice to victims, and ultimately presiding over a situation where victims got nothing back, all while he's making statements acknowledging the deep systemic problems.
It's a narrative full of contradictions. Based on these sources, the rhetoric versus the reality seems to be the central conflict.
So let's leave our listeners with a final thought, drawing from Medcraft's own words. He apparently said at one point he'd rather people sort out the issues between themselves rather than involving ASIC.
Yeah, that quote really stands out.
So here's the question for you to ponder. If the head of the country's corporate watchdog expresses a preference for people not involving the regulator, what does that truly signal about its commitment to consumers, especially those who've lost everything, their life savings, their superannuation to sophisticated systemic fraud? When the free market just becomes a vehicle for theft, where does that leave the victims?